I'm bold enough to say it. I think that in an online course, expectations are everything. And what I mean by that is not just students' expectations, but you making your expectations clear to your students. You need to be very upfront with them about your expectations for how they'll participate. And this really goes for online discussions especially. You'll need to be clear about how many posts or responses you expect from them in each module of the course. You'll need to be clear about your expectations for style and grammar. Are you okay with them using text speak? Do they have to use the conventions of standard written English? You'll need to be very upfront and clear with them about that. You should be clear with them about when in the module they should post. I often want students to post by about halfway through the module, and that gives time for their classmates to respond to those posts. And so you will need to make that, if that's something you expect, you'll need to communicate that very clearly to your students. As you start thinking about facilitating discussion, my big advice for you is to get out of the way. If it's really intended to be a discussion, you're going to have to find ways of getting the students to do the talking. You should definitely be present, but don't dominate. And that can be a fine line to walk. I continue to struggle with that in my own teaching practice. Part of facilitation might mean that you're going to be thoughtful about offering alternative perspectives. You might, when students bring something up, if you know of a great resource, you might share a resource with them to help them think more deeply about the topic that they're discussing. And one thing that I started doing recently in my online courses is to try to always wrap up every discussion myself by creating kind of a summary of, okay, we've talked about these things and here's where things stand right now, and to try to encapsulate everybody's thinking. You can also do that along the way if you need to get the discussion back on track. If students are kind of going off where you want them to be, you need to be part of the facilitation process here, but trying to do that in a way without dominating the discussion. One other thing we should talk about here a minute is you need to be thoughtful about how you're going to assess your students' participation in an online forum. I always struggle with this one. And the reason I struggle with assessing this is because I think the analog of assessing discussion in a face-to-face course seems kind of weird to me. I don't think about assigning points to how many times they speak up in a face-to-face class. But there is some merit to thinking about that for an online course, because you aren't probably going to lecture, at least not in the same way that you would lecture in a face-to-face course. And the way they participate in their online discussion is probably more like showing up to class and being present, being actively part of the class. And so for that, you might consider grading, or at least finding some way to assess their contributions, their work. So you'll need to think some about that for yourself. How comfortable do you feel with grading your students' discussions? And if you are going to, you might think about grading in terms of completion or participation. I don't know, you might think about grading the content depending on the course that you're teaching. That might be helpful for you. And I would encourage you to think about using a rubric. And I'll show you the rubric that I use. When I am trying to assess my students, a sample rubric for contribution, I say here. So you can see each of these categories that I have in here. It's more of just a checklist. I put that note on here. It's not so much that I'm going to mark off 5 points if they're not doing these things. And eventually I internalize this checklist for myself, so I don't need to feel like I need to have it sitting next to me for every time. But a lot of these things comes back to what I said before about expectations. You need to communicate this really clearly to students. What do you expect them to do? And then hold them to it. If they're not meeting your expectations, be sure to give them feedback on that to redirect them.